Hello and welcome, and I know you guys are very hungry for dinner. So we're going to try and make this fit within the requisite time. But having said that, having just spent the last few minutes speaking to my guest, this is a woman who is making a substantial impact in the world of media and film in a region perhaps not best known for gender equality. Let me just very quickly explain who I'm sitting next to. It's none other than Her Royal Highness Princess Rym, who founded the Jordanian Media Institute in 2007. Its aim is to establish an Arab Centre of excellence for journalism education. She's also been the member of the Board of Commissioners of Jordan's Royal Film Commission since 2005. Prior to marrying His Royal Highness, Prince Ali bin Ali Hussein, Princess Rym worked extensively in the media for international broadcasters, including CNN. She's also worked for the BBC, Dubai TV, Bloomberg TV, and United Press International. She received a prestigious alumni award from the Columbia University School of Journalism in 2011, along with another award for her excellence in international journalism. Thank you so much for joining us today, Your Royal
Thank you
Highness.
so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's give Princess Rym a warm round of applause. Originally, I am from Australia, as you can tell from my accent, but I spent a number of years as a Middle East correspondent. One thing that struck me when I was working out there was the absence of female representation in the media, not to mention the public landscape as well. What you're doing, I imagine, is quite revolutionary in terms of ensuring that gender issues are addressed, both in the world of film and journalism.
Thank you. Well, we've been trying from the outset to really work on, of course, media standards everywhere. But creating the Jordan Media Institute has really given us an opportunity to push a little more when it comes to women. As you say, we actually did a gender monitoring report a few years ago, and we monitored media in Jordan and how women were represented and the proportion which they were represented. And of course, the findings were very eye-opening, and I think it gave us it was very revealing. It gave us a good idea of what more needed to be done. As you say, not only in terms of how many female journalists are there, but also what level of representation they have. And then there's I think it's a universal problem, the issue of which experts you invite. And we definitely need to invite more women experts on TV sets or in interviews, generally speaking.
And certainly that's a figure that comes up consistently in the world, and it's here in France and in other regions, that normally it's around 1 in 5 guests on air are women. I assume it's the same sort of statistic where you are as well.
Yes, I would probably vouch to say less than that.
So what gave you the idea for the Jordan Media Institute?
In fact, it's something that, funny enough, I had been thinking about for a while, never thinking that I'd be in a position to do that. But as a journalist covering the Middle East, I used to think there's probably something more. I used to see there was a little bit of journalists in the Middle East tend to be a bit disheartened. There were a lot of issues with not only their training, but their access. And I thought there's surely something that can be done to make this a profession with more spark. And in our part of the world, and I think it's not just in our part of the world, but in our part of the world, definitely, people want their children to be engineers and doctors. They don't want them really to be journalists if they can help it. But I wanted journalism to be a profession that you're proud to do. And so, we did the master's program. We made it a very different kind of master's program, and we especially I wanted the Arabic-speaking media to have access to those same standards, to be exposed in the same way as people who go and study abroad to the US maybe or Britain, but then they end up maybe working in English. So I really wanted to try and bridge that gap as well.
And it's not just journalists, is it, that you're working with? It's also making the consumer aware as a result. And media literacy is a real issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so that exactly ties back to when we started the program. We started to do some training before we established the master's program. And the training revealed to me something that maybe some of you would have guessed, but by the time we train people, whether we give them human rights and gender training in the media, I almost want to say it's too late. I'm very grateful for all the efforts, and I think we still have to continue. But you do want to start this effort much early on in age. And so that gave me the idea, once we established the master's program, I thought, okay, now we have to really look at what we can do at a younger age. And so we started a program of media literacy, which we do in schools. We started in government schools. And the results were frankly breathtaking, because through media literacy, when you're talking to young teenagers, boys and girls, you can introduce all these values of human rights, of gender equality, that you'd like them to grow up with, because you really have to, it has to be embedded in you. It's very difficult to learn later on in age.
And how has that gone down with both boys and girls in those classes?
It was, I mean, I have to say it was probably one of the most rewarding moments I've had, because I met with them after a year's training, and to see how well they had understood why this was important, how empowered they felt. I mean, a 15-year-old girl actually stood up and said, "It's the first time in my life I've been asked to think for myself, and it feels great." And that in itself, to me, said, oh, I felt this means we're definitely on the right track. There's a boy who came to me and said how he's so proud because his mum showed him something, and now he knows where to check facts. So he realized, he said, "No, Mum, this is all Photoshop. This is all, you know." And again, he felt so proud. These teenagers realize they can't be manipulated. And imagine all you can do, again, in terms of values that, you know, you can instill at a young age.
We've talked about, at the beginning, about the need for greater female representation, but it's not just who you have on as guests. It's also having women journalists involved in all sectors of reporting, isn't it? And you were a war correspondent, spending time in Iraq and Afghanistan. I would say, as a former Middle East correspondent, it is so important to have women in those positions, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I really like how you framed that, because a lot of the times, you know, I'm said, oh, you know, wasn't that a bit hard for a woman being in a war zone? Actually, well, I don't think it was harder being a woman in a war zone than being a woman journalist anywhere else. I do think, though, that it was a huge advantage to be a woman, because it gave me access and an edge in my storytelling. I could go into women's homes, into places that were normally closed off to other men, and to men, and I could really have such a holistic approach, I suppose, to my stories, because I had all different backgrounds, and it was a much, I think, richer approach in many ways.
We often talk about it when we are, as women in those environments, that we almost become gender neutral, like a third sex as a result. And you are given access not only just to women, but to men as well.
That's exactly right. You have access to well, you get the entire picture, as opposed to getting part of the picture, because there's a lot that is, when you talk to women, you're talking about children, you're talking about schools, you're talking about things maybe that men might talk about, but maybe not as much, or in the same way, or with the same perspective as a lot of the women. So you really get all the angles, including the men's angles. And I think it always makes, as a reporter, I always felt, you know, I had access to so many more angles and stories. And on the contrary, I felt very privileged, actually.
Is it hard to talk about feminism in your part of the world, or is it seen very much as being an import from the West?
It's tricky. It can be seen as an import for the West, from the West, and I think it's important not to import feminism models from the West. That said, I mean, gender equality is a value. Again, it's like human rights. There is no cultural specificity. Human rights is or should be universal, like gender equality. What there is, though, are different ways of approaching. On the one hand, I think women in the Middle East resent the Orientalist view that some people might have on women, and also maybe resent being portrayed as victims all the time, because they do so much. I mean, women in Jordan and the Middle East have been working to push for equality for many, many years. But as far as seeing a big mass movement or mass mobilization, I think in Jordan, at any rate, we're still a little bit shy of that. There are movements, there's projects. Recently there was violence against a woman, a huge crime committed against a woman. There were demonstrations. There have been demonstrations against honor crimes, but I think there still needs to be that big push. And maybe we've seen that now in the demonstrations.
And that's something that we've been reporting on the 51% and on our French sister show, Actuel, is the fact that for the first time ever, and I can say this as somebody who's covered that part of the world, you are seeing large numbers of women at the front lines of those protests in South Sudan, in Lebanon, in Algeria, in Iraq. Women are finding their voices, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think maybe we can say since 2011, there's been a turning point in women occupying more of a public space in the region, in joining these mass demonstrations. And so this is something interesting. In Sudan and Iraq are quite conservative societies. And to see women coming down in the street, I was told, for instance, in Baghdad that there were 3 generations of women who took to the streets, and the mother was initially quite reluctant. Her 2 university-aged daughters wanted to go down. Then she realized, well, actually, this is about my daughters and their future, and she grabbed her own mother, and they just went down into the streets. In Lebanon, it's been amazing. Lebanese women have long suffered also from a stereotype, the sexual, a bit simple-minded lady. Well, they've proven that they're about substance, and they've rejected that stereotype, no matter how, the different media covering them has portrayed them. They've really managed to defy that, and so I think that there has been some change, and we can probably see more.
But the thing is, whenever there is change, there's pushback. Where do you think this is all going to end up? Is it going to be the case that these women now are going to demand greater political representation, for instance?
I think, women do demand greater political representation. I think I would say more caveat with 2 things. Let's start with the pushback and then the women representation. The pushback comes with, yes, as you say, the more you push to change, the more there'll be some pushback. And social media really gives you a platform to see that and to witness that, because as much as it gives women a platform for their voices to be heard, it also gives a platform for the more conservative voices and the less progressive voices to be heard. And sometimes those voices tend to be louder. So now it's about really occupying that space in the media. It was also one of the reasons why I created JMI, because I thought, this is an opportunity for professional journalists to also, come through. But social media can be very powerful for everybody, but you need to sort of have these other stories, these alternative stories, these stories of gender equity where women are more fairly represented. And you do that through encouraging women to tell their stories in the news, in the media, but also through film. And so at the Royal Film Commission, that's what we do with the training as well.
And that's where I was about to ask you, because we've been talking a lot about the news media, but very quickly, I want to ask you about your work in the film industry and what you've been doing in regards to gender equality.
So with the Film Commission, we've worked a lot to encourage the youth and also, everybody to again tell their stories through film. My husband created the Royal Film Commission 16 years ago, and I've been actively working on it as well since 2005. We have film clubs around the country, not just in Amman, and in very remote places in the country. We have cinebuses. We help provide access to public schools, in public schools to films. So we've helped girls actually join film clubs where maybe their families would have been a little bit reluctant at first, but now they're part of it and they tell stories about women fixing problems. And we've also encouraged a lot of films to be screened in schools. And in the beginning, we got pushback, for instance, from one school, a public school that was very reluctant. I think the director must have been extremely conservative, and he didn't really want films with men and women in them. And I just thought, you have to stand your ground. So we did that, but we can't go back. So we showed a film, and now 5 years on, we showed a film that didn't have women in it, just because it was important to show films. But 5 years on, now we're showing, I forgot the name of the film, Hidden Figures. We're showing hidden figures in these schools. And so that, I would say, is progress. But it shows that I think if you if you're stubborn, basically, maybe you can get to where you want to.
And as you told me behind stage, it's also the fact the country now proportionately has a higher number of female filmmakers.
Yes, and that's something that's, we're very proud of. There's proportionately more Arab women filmmakers than there are women filmmakers in the West. And so that's something we need to keep pushing, because they can do the storytelling and tell stories about women.
So finally, what would be your call to action?
My call to action is, I would say actually, let's provide as many opportunities as we can for women to know one another, and to, across continent, doesn't matter, north, south, east, west, south, south. I'd love to see women from Europe in newsrooms or on film sets in our part of the world, and vice versa, or from Africa in Jordan, or from Jordan in Asia. I mean, I think these conversations are priceless, and it's worth investing in, because that's also what brings about inclusion.
Can you please give Her Royal Highness a warm round of applause for what she's doing?
Thank you very much.